Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be
4 months after Cyprus was bailed out, the country is back in the news.
Thank you, Eva.
International lenders are now reviewing how the island is meeting the conditions of its $13 billion bailout. That deal was secured in March to pull Cyprus away from the brink of financial meltdown. Well, the government is hoping to get a good report card and get even more money in September. Finance Minister Harris has expressed optimism international creditors will give his country a positive evaluation. He said Cyprus is trying to restore its banking sector to health. But according to Cypriot President Nikos Anastasiadis, the rescue is not working. In fact, he says, the agreement has ended up hurting more than expected. So much so, the country is entering a new crisis. In return for $13 billion from the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the IMF, the so-called troika, bank customers had to give up a portion of their money. It had never been done before, and it was called a bail-in. On the night the agreement was clinched in March, Sarris tried to put a happy face on it. He had to, because he was the finance minister then.
Tonight is a good night for Cyprus and the Eurozone.
But Sarris now tells Al Jazeera he felt abused and bullied by the Europeans.
You feel violated, you feel a terrible injustice being done to you. You feel abandoned by your partners with none of the European ministers speaking up. But then you say, I swallow all that very bitter feeling. I go home, I take a deal that is not good, but is much better than the alternative that could have unraveled.
So what went wrong in Cyprus? Was the agreement flawed from the beginning? Who's really pulling the strings? And what's it really like to negotiate when your country's facing the abyss? You'll find out as the former finance minister of Cyprus talks to Al Jazeera. Thanks so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure.
Now, you were the Minister of Finance in the early days when the negotiations were beginning between Cyprus and the Troika. Take us through some of those early meetings. How did the idea of a bail-in come up?
For some time now, the strong partner of the Troika, which is the International Monetary Fund, and the most influential country in the Eurozone, Germany, felt strongly that the financing program of Cyprus should involve the participation of bank depositors, the so-called bailin. Germany was relying on the IMF for their technical analysis on debt sustainability. In other words, how much money Cyprus could borrow safely and be able to repay it. And at the same time, on their advice on what to do with banks, which in their judgment were insolvent. We knew that there was a strong view amongst the European partners to do it. And therefore, we prepared very well to present alternatives. We said some more orthodox measures. We had measures of fiscal restraint. We had more taxes, even on taxes on deposits, which we believed would have gone a long way towards financing our needs without taking our debt to dangerous levels.
Okay, but how there? You said you were going to propose taxes on deposits. How is that different from a bail-in, which is basically taking money from deposits?
I'm sorry, I should have said taxes on interest rates. Interest rates in Cyprus are high. There are deposits that earn 5% or more. The average, because many of them of course earn zero because they are current accounts, is 3.2. So we believe that we could get about $1 billion a year from those. So together with raising the corporate taxation, together with raising some other relatively minor fiscal measures, we believe that we cut an adequate package. Unfortunately,
Of how much? Sorry, how much are we talking here that you presented to them?
the total financing for Cyprus was 17.5 billion. They said they would give us 10 billion. So there was a gap of 7.5. What we had argued really is that we are going to be able to come up with most of that. But in the interest of having a program that did not go into these very unorthodox members like bailins, they could have increased their contribution a bit.
So you asked them for a little more than 10
We
billion.
asked them for a little more, and we also asked them to take into account that Cyprus has a substantial wealth coming up in a few years in the form of natural gas, something that they did not want to consider. We said to them, we have this so-called upside risk. In a few years' time, we will have resources to help us pay our debt. How do we know that? A number of very serious companies have already paid hundreds of millions for the license to drill for natural gas in our waters. These companies are public companies responsible to their shareholders. They do not do these things lightly. So we believe there is good reason to expect that we will get some help from our energy sector.
Okay, so this was your response to them. I've got an alternative plan without taking money from depositors. What was their response?
Their response was negative. On the latter part, on the energy, that it was too far in the future and too uncertain to factor in. Then they also said that our banks are insolvent and they must not be kept alive. The IMF said we have made that mistake before, we have kept banks going, and that we are not going to do again. And because Cyprus is a small country that is systemically unimportant in their view, meaning that they could do things in Cyprus and get away with it from the point of view of them spreading in other countries.
So wait a minute, you're telling me basically you feel bullied.
Absolutely, absolutely. We were put in front of extremely cruel dilemmas. Either you accept or what you are telling us, or we are going to put the plug and you are not going to have any banks anyhow, you are not going to have any liquidity assistance from the central bank, so you are going into bankruptcy basically.
But why do you think the troika and Germany would want to bully you?
Well, there is a number of explanations. One is that, and this is partly our fault because we let this to drag on, Germany has an important election coming up in September in which Mrs. Merkel is being challenged by the opposition for being too soft on the so-called Southerners, of being too ready to tax the German taxpayer in order to help the easygoing Greek, Cypriot, Italian, Portuguese, and Irish. Those episodes were done during a period that were not close to the election.
And now we are.
Now we are.
So you feel like you're the political price for an upcoming election?
In a very large extent, yes. And I also think, and here we have to respect the technocratic approach of the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has an axe to grind with Europe. They say to them, you bullied me into accepting a program for Greece that makes its debt unsustainable. You're not going to bully me again. And that was one of the reasons why the IMF stood so firm on this idea of debt sustainability and depositor bailin.
I wonder if I could read to you, though, sir, what Michael Fuchs, he's a deputy leader of Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats in Parliament. This is what he said. He said, there is a lot of, let's say, difficult money in Cypriot accounts. We want this to be taxed. Is it not also possible that the reason why they opted for a bail-in is because they believe that by bailing out Cyprus in this case, they would ultimately be bailing out depositors whose money is of, shall we say, dishonest origin.
Right. Clearly, that was something that came up repeatedly. There are 2-3 points to make on that. First of all, many large Russian businessmen, because this is what we're talking about, in fact the largest, are present in some of the European capitals that are trying to lecture us. In Cyprus, we tend to have a larger number of smaller Russian businessmen who are looking for a country where is the rule of law, where they do partnerships with other people and invest back in Russia. And when they have problems, they can go to a Cypriot court or a court where it is a common law. In other words, often they don't have faith in their own legal system. Now, it is possible that particularly in the early years, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and a large number of people with lots of money that have gone around Europe, that we didn't ask as many questions as we should have from where that money came from. On the other hand, it happens everywhere. We have passed tests, they have come here, they have looked at the systems that we have, and they have said that they were adequate. But I agree with you, when our model depends on international business. You see, unlike the Germans, we do not produce cars. We don't have a manufacturing sector, but we have a well-educated workforce that works in law, works in commerce, works in the accounting profession. These people work with foreign companies who use Cyprus because of its friendly tax system. That is not a crime, but it is a source of jealousy from many countries who would also like this business. And that has to be factored in also as one of the motivation for the lack of support that Cyprus had in this adventure.
So there's jealousy by who? Who's jealous of you and is now trying to put some really tough conditions?
I think, for example, one country that, and I don't want to use that in the same sentence, but for example, it is no secret that a country like Holland would like to attract more business of the kind that Cyprus has been able to attract. And Holland has been one of the most vocal supporters of the German IMF point of view.
All right, so at this point in your discussions with the troika, you've presented an alternative plan, and they've turned it down. Did you have a C plan? You know, a lot of the criticism of politicians was that you caved in too easily. What happened?
Look, we are presented with a very clear choice. There was no room for plan C.
No room for discussion?
No room, well, there was discussion. We discussed until 4 in the morning. We repeated the arguments that what was being proposed was bad for Cyprus, even worse for Europe and the financial stability of the Eurozone. But they were sticking to their point, saying, look, we cannot pass anything different from what we propose from our parliaments. We cannot get the IMF to agree to it. If the IMF doesn't agree to it, our parliaments will say, why should put our money where the IMF refuses to do? So it was a classic case of take it or leave it. We're going to stay with you for another hour. You don't take it, we will go home. You go home, you have no package, you have no deal, you have the very real threat that your banks will close, you will have to print money that nobody is going to accept, you're not going to be able to import anything, so it's your choice. You either come to terms with what we are proposing or you take the consequences. And every responsible person has to look at that possibility. You feel violated, you feel a terrible injustice being done to you. You feel abandoned by your partners with none of the European ministers speaking up. but then you say, I swallow all that very bitter feeling. I go home, I take a deal that is not good, but is much better than the alternative that could have unraveled. And I do believe that the first deal we had on March 16 would have been something that would have been manageable.
I'm wondering, in that discussion, did you ever make the argument to them that it just doesn't sound right to people who've put their money in a bank and then the bank's messed up, but they then lose their deposits? And I'm intrigued to know if you made that argument and how they responded to you. How can we be the first country in Europe, at least, if not the world, where we just go and take people's money from their accounts?
Absolutely, we made it. And I repeat again, we said it is very bad for those people. It is even worse for those.
What was their response? Was there any human connection or empathy towards the deposit holders?
You know what they said, and very responsible, otherwise responsible people, they told me, Minister, look, we wouldn't like to be in your position. But if we were in your position, which we wouldn't because you are in a very difficult position, we would not impose to the next generation such a very heavy debt. So, borrow some money, the 10 billion that you can service, and make the people, and I'm now paraphrasing, who have had a good time for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and they have amassed large deposits in the bank, make them contribute something. Let's have an appropriate, as they said, and I'm quoting, burden sharing between this generation, unorthodox as it may be, and the next generation that will have to repay the debt if you borrow all the money that you need now.
They might have a point as well, in a sense, though, sir, that the mess wasn't created by the EU or the IMF, was it? There clearly was some very bad decision-making going on in Cypriot banks.
We do not deny that. Not only banks. We should have taken more seriously our membership to the Eurozone. Like other countries, we have shown fiscal irresponsibility, which have allowed our debt and our deficit to grow, therefore putting us in a position that when the banks got into difficulty, we couldn't help them. We already had too much debt.
So who's responsible for that? Who do you blame for that?
I think successive governments, but particularly the last government.
What about the regulators, though? I know in politics, you're a member of one party, and it's not unusual for a member of one party to criticize members of the former party or the former government. But what about the regulators?
Yes.
Where were they?
Before the regulator, the board of directors and the chief executives of banks bear a heavy responsibility for overexpansion, both geographical in a number of countries and also rapid credit expansion. I also feel, although in those days investing in sovereign debt was considered solid, because nobody until the Greek PSI became fashionable, became the order of the day. Nobody had dreamt that any sovereign would have defaulted. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had no spread between the Greek and the German debt until 2009. People were lending Greece at the same cost as Germany as late as 2009 because they believed there was no difference. But I believe we should have been more careful about concentrating so much of our bank portfolio in one basket.
But what was happening then? Because I know that you were also on the board of directors, were you not, for one of the troubled banks, Laiki?
Yes.
What was happening? How were the board of directors and the management of the banks then making that mistake which you're talking about,
Yes.
buying a lot of Greek?
It was a different story in the banks, in the two banks. First of all, I came to the board of Laiki Bank in January 2012 when most of the damage had already been done, and my job was to find, was an impossible job actually, to find an investor for a bank that was very unattractive, particularly with the Greek exposure.
But did you ask these questions in retrospect and ask them, why did you buy so many Greek bonds?
Absolutely.
Why didn't you spread your bets around, at least, as you're now
Absolutely,
saying?
absolutely.
What was the answer that you got?
There were a number of answers that really do not stand up to reason, saying that we never believed there was a risk, that they were profitable, we were buying them at 80% to the euro, they were paying 10%, even after 3 years, we would have made 40, 50%. None of us would have dreamt that there was going to be a haircut on more than 40, 50. There was very faulty reasoning.
So what do you think the real reason was? But I mean, most people know you don't need to be a banker or an accountant to think to spread your bets a little bit, do you?
Yes.
What do you think the real reason was?
Yes.
Was it political?
No, I think it was excessive zeal to show profit and underestimation of the risk. The same thing that happened with exotic products in the United States in the years leading up to 2008. In our case, we had plain vanilla products, but we made the same terrible mistakes. Greed for excessive profitability, to show results, to get bonuses, the kinds of things that have plagued the banking system throughout the world for the last 10 years.
Does any part of you also perhaps blame Greece, the Greek government at least, and maybe some of the international accounting firms who, shall we say, weren't being very straightforward in presenting the real picture about Greece's public debt? Do you blame them at all?
Well, I don't think it was the accountants in Greece. I think there was some misrepresentation of the true picture over periods of time. Greece made its own choices, it got in its own mess. It was up to us.
But it got you in a mess as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yes, well, look, it's like, how do you feel if you had bought the shares of a company that went bad? You are angry that it was mismanaged, but you are equally angry with yourself that you are not as careful to read the signs early enough and get out while there was time.
Well, now that we have this bailout, which includes a bail-in, and it's going to include some austerity measures, some privatization. When you look at all of these elements, do you think this can work?
Look, I thought that the Memorandum of Understanding, as it was put together, was by and large sensible. It had a lot of things that we had discussed for many years here in Cyprus that we didn't have the political courage to implement.
Okay, but it also has, you've pointed out, some bad ideas, or ideas that at the time you told the troika this is a really bad idea.
To be frank, the jury is out. We have been dealt an assault of seismic proportions. The system, the banking system, as we know it, is changing dramatically. Business confidence is below zero, if that is possible.
Do you think you'll lose a lot of investors because of that?
I think so, and I think we will have an increase in unemployment, the most cruel of all indicators, when people have no jobs to go to and they lose their self-respect.
So how will you get out of that spiral which other countries have found themselves in, that once you start making those austerity cuts, your economy shrinks, and then you've got even less money to pay back the original loans?
Yes.
Then you have to go and ask for more money. Are you confident you're not going to be in that position?
We have to be very careful. I think austerity is something that if you had lived beyond your means, you have to do. You cannot escape austerity. You cannot escape it as an individual. You cannot escape it as a company, you cannot escape it as a country if you have lived beyond your means and you have overborrowed. You have to do it, and you have to pay the penalty of the adjustment. You hope, as you said, that that is not so drastic that it really kills the patient.
Mr. Sarris, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much also.